They drove away without even rolling down the window. I was 8 years old, standing on my grandfather's porch in a town called Millbrook, Ohio, holding a suitcase that was too heavy for my arms and a stuffed rabbit that was missing one eye. My mother didn't look back. My father didn't slow down at the stop sign at the end of the street, even though he always slowed down there. It was like they couldn't get away from me fast enough. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I would live under the same roof as my parents. And I definitely didn't know that the old man standing behind me, the one with flour on his hands because he'd been in the middle of baking bread, was about to become the only person in my life who ever chose me on purpose. 15 years later, I would stand in a lawyer's office and watch my parents' faces go white as a piece of paper destroyed everything they thought they were entitled to. This is the story of how my grandfather's silence built an empire, and how his final instruction made sure the people who abandoned me got exactly what they deserved. Nothing. My name is Daniel Foster, and before I tell you about the day my parents left, you need to understand what kind of people they were. My father, Richard Foster, was a man who believed the world owed him something. He'd grown up comfortable, the only son of a man who'd built a small hardware store into a modest chain of home improvement shops across 3 counties. Richard was supposed to inherit that business one day. Instead, he spent his 20s and 30s chasing get-rich-quick schemes, a car dealership that folded in 18 months, a restaurant that never opened, a real estate investment group that turned out to be 3 guys in a rented office with a fax machine. My mother, Denise, wasn't much different. She'd married my father because he came from money, or at least the appearance of it, and she never quite forgave him or me for the fact that the money never showed up the way she expected. I was born into that mess in 2001. And for 8 years, I existed mostly as an inconvenience. Not abused, exactly nothing that would have shown up on a report if anyone had been looking. Just unwanted. Forgotten at school pickup more times than I could count. Left with neighbors for a few hours that turned into entire weekends. I learned very young how to make myself small, how to not need things, because needing things made my parents' faces tighten in a way that scared me more than yelling ever could. Then, in the fall of 2009, my father found out about a business opportunity in Arizona. A friend of a friend was starting a company, something about solar panel installation, before that was even really a big industry. It required capital. It required my parents to relocate. And apparently, it required them to not have an 8-year-old in tow. I remember the conversation. Or rather, I remember not being part of it. I was sent to my room while they talked in the kitchen, and I sat at the top of the stairs and listened. Just for a little while, my mother said. Until we get settled. Dad won't mind, my father said. He's got that big house. Just him rattling around in it since Mom died. He'll probably be glad for the company. 2 days later, we drove 3 hours to Millbrook, Ohio, to my grandfather's house. A house I'd only visited a handful of times because my father and grandfather didn't get along. I didn't understand why then. I understand perfectly now. My grandfather, Walter Foster, opened the door before we even knocked. He was 71 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life because he had. He took one look at my father's face, and then at mine, and something in his expression shifted, like a man recalculating a math problem he'd already solved once before and hoped he wouldn't have to solve again. How long? Grandpa Walter said. It wasn't really a question. A few months. Maybe less, my father said. We just need to get this business off the ground, Dad. It's a sure thing. It's always a sure thing with you, Richard. My father's jaw tightened. My mother stared at a point somewhere over my grandfather's shoulder, refusing to make eye contact with either of us. And I just stood there, holding my suitcase and my one-eyed rabbit, waiting to be told what was happening to me. Say goodbye to your grandfather, Danny, my mother finally said. I looked at my parents' car in the driveway, engines still running, and something in my small chest understood, the way children understand things adults think they're too young to grasp, that this wasn't a few months. This was goodbye in the real sense of the word. I hugged my mother. She patted my back twice, the way you'd pat a coworker. My father ruffled my hair and said, "Be good for Grandpa." Then they got in the car and they drove away, and neither of them looked back. A few months turned into 15 years. I want to tell you about my grandfather because everything that happens later only makes sense if you understand who Walter Foster actually was. He was not a soft man. He didn't say "I love you" every day, and he wasn't the type to sit you down for long emotional conversations. But that first night, after my parents' taillights disappeared down the road, he crouched down to my eye level on the porch, his knees cracking audibly, and he said something I have never forgotten. "I don't know what your parents told you," he said, "but you're not a burden. You hear me? You're not an inconvenience, and you're not a problem to be solved. You're my grandson, and as long as I'm breathing, you've got a home." That's not a maybe. That's a fact. I didn't believe him. Not that first night. 8-year-olds who've just been left on a porch don't believe anything anyone tells them. But over the following weeks, and then months, and then years, my grandfather proved it in 1,000 small ways that added up to something enormous. He learned my school schedule and never once missed a pickup. He came to every single school event, Grandparents' Day, science fairs, the truly disastrous middle school production of Our Town where I had exactly one line and forgot it. He sat in the front row every time. He taught me things my father never had the patience for: how to change a tire, how to read a balance sheet, how to shake a man's hand like you meant it. He ran what remained of the family hardware business, Foster and Sons Home Supply, which by then was down to 2 locations after my father's various failed ventures had drained resources from the company over the years. Grandpa Walter had spent 2 decades quietly rebuilding what my father's recklessness had cost the family, store by store, decision by decision. And here's the thing about my parents during all this: they didn't disappear entirely. That would almost have been easier. Instead, they drifted in and out like weather. A phone call on my birthday sometimes. A visit at Christmas, maybe 1 year in 3, always short, always leaving me with the impression that they were doing me a favor by showing up at all. The solar panel business in Arizona failed within a year, of course it did, and my father moved on to the next scheme, and the next, always somewhere else, always too busy, too broke, too in transition to come get me. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped waiting by the window when they said they'd visit. By 14, I'd stopped counting the days since I'd last heard from them. By 16, when my school held a father-son event, I brought my grandfather, and when someone asked if he was my dad, I said yes before I even thought about it. He heard me say it. He never mentioned it, but I saw his eyes get bright, and he cleared his throat and changed the subject the way men of his generation do when they're too moved to speak. My parents, meanwhile, occasionally resurfaced, usually when they needed something. My father asked my grandfather for a loan in 2014. Another in 2016. Each time, Grandpa Walter helped quietly, without lecturing, though I know it cost him more than money. Each time, my father disappeared again once the check cleared, like a man paying off a debt he didn't feel he owed. I finished high school with honors. My grandfather sat in the front row at graduation, in a suit he'd had for probably 20 years, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. My parents did not attend. They sent a card. It arrived 4 days late. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studying business, because I wanted to understand the thing my grandfather had spent his whole life protecting. I came home every school break. I worked summers at the store, learning the business from the ground floor, inventory, staffing, the ledgers, the way Grandpa Walter negotiated with suppliers with a patience that looked like kindness, but was really just extremely disciplined strategy. And, through all of it, my parents remained exactly what they'd always been, people who orbited my life from a distance, showing up only when it served them. In the spring of my junior year of college, my grandfather called me and asked me to come home for the weekend. Nothing unusual in that, I came home most weekends anyway. But something in his voice was different. Careful. Measured in a way that wasn't like him. He was 79 by then, still sharp, still working 4 days a week at the store, even though I'd been telling him to slow down for years. When I got to the house, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of him. "Sit down, Danny," he said. He told me it was pancreatic cancer. Stage 3, moving towards stage 4. The doctors were talking in terms of months, not years. I won't pretend I handled that news well. I sat in that kitchen and cried like the 8-year-old boy who'd stood on that porch 15 years earlier, and my grandfather, the strongest man I'd ever known, held onto my shoulder and let me fall apart, and then, once I'd cried myself out, he did something I didn't expect. He started talking business. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I've had a long time to think about what happens after I'm gone. Longer than you know. I started thinking about it the day your parents drove away from this house and left you standing on my porch." He told me that from that very first year, he'd made a decision. Not out of spite, he was very clear about that, but out of clarity. He said watching his own son abandon his grandson for a solar panel scheme had shown him, in a single afternoon, exactly what kind of man his son had become. And he decided, right then, that whatever he built for the rest of his life, he would build it for the boy standing in front of him, not for the son who'd walked away. "Your father thinks he's going to inherit this business," he said. "He's been thinking that since before you were even born." I let him think it, because there was no reason to have that fight while I was alive to still run things my way. But I want you to know the truth now, before I go, so there's no confusion. And so you understand why I'm about to ask you to do something difficult. He told me the business, both remaining store locations, the property they sat on, the investment accounts he'd built over 50 years of careful, unglamorous saving, and the house we were sitting in, all of it, every last dollar, was going to me. Not split with my parents. Not held in some trust they'd have access to. Entirely, completely to me. They had a son, he said, and they treated him like luggage. They don't get to collect a reward for that. I built this so it would go to someone who'd actually take care of it, and take care of the people who work for it. That's you. That was always going to be you. Then he told me the difficult part. He wanted the will structured a very specific way, one that would require a public reading, with my parents present, and one final instruction attached to it that he wanted carried out exactly as written, no matter what anyone said or did in that room. I asked him why it had to be public, why he wanted them there to hear it read out loud instead of just finding out through a lawyer's letter. He looked at me for a long moment. "Because some people," he said, "don't learn a lesson unless they feel it happen in real time." My grandfather lived another 11 months after that conversation, longer than the doctors expected, which he attributed, only half joking, to spite and store inventory management. During that year, something strange happened. My parents, somehow catching wind that Grandpa Walter was sick, I suspect through a cousin who couldn't keep a secret, suddenly reappeared with an intensity they'd never shown in 15 years. Phone calls twice a week. A visit in the spring, then another in the summer. My mother brought soup she'd clearly bought pre-made and transferred into a pot to look homemade. My father started calling him Dad in a soft, performative voice I'd genuinely never heard him use before, not once, in my entire childhood. I watched my grandfather endure these visits with a patience that amazed me. He was polite. He let my mother fuss over his blankets. He let my father sit with him and reminisce about a childhood my father had, by his own admission years earlier, resented. He never once let on what he'd told me in that kitchen. He never gave them a single hint about the will. I asked him once, during that final summer, how he could just sit there and let them perform like that, knowing what he knew. "Let them have their scene, Danny," he said. "It doesn't cost me anything. And it tells me everything I need to know about why I made the decision I made. Watch how differently they treat you now that they think there might be money on the table." That's the whole answer right there if you're paying attention. He was right. I noticed it too, the way my father started calling me champ for the first time since I was 7 years old, the way my mother asked, with false casualness, whether I'd talked to a lawyer about the family's affairs. It made my skin crawl, honestly, watching them try to get back into good standing after a decade and a half of near total absence. The moment there was a dying man and a business in the picture. Grandpa Walter passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, with me holding his hand. His last words to me weren't dramatic. He simply said, "You know what to do," and squeezed my hand once, and then he was gone. I didn't know what to do. He'd made sure of that. The reading of the will took place 3 weeks later, in the office of Harold Given, the attorney who'd handled my grandfather's affairs for almost 30 years. My parents arrived early, dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than mourning a father. My father wore a suit I'd never seen before. My mother had had her hair done. I sat on one side of the room. My parents sat on the other, close together, my mother's hand resting on my father's knee in a gesture of unity I found almost comical given everything I knew. Mr. Given cleared his throat and began reading. The early parts of the will were procedural, small personal items left to a few longtime employees at the store, a modest sum to the local library where my grandfather had volunteered for 2 decades, a donation to the fire department that had once saved his house from an electrical fire when my father was a teenager. Then Mr. Given reached the main portion of the document. To my son, Richard Foster, he read, and his wife, Denise Foster, I leave the following. My father sat up straighter. My mother's grip on his knee tightened. Nothing. The word hung in the room like a held breath. I want to be direct here, as my father was direct with me about how this should be read, Mr. Given continued, reading Walter's own written words. Richard, you are my son, and I loved you the only way I knew how, even when you made that difficult. But on a fall day in 2009, you and Denise drove away from my house and left your 8-year-old son on my porch, and you did not look back. Not once. I watched you not look back. That image never left me. You told me it would be a few months. It was 15 years. In that time, you called on birthdays when you remembered them. You visited 3 or 4 times a year when it was convenient. And in the last 11 months of my life, once you learned I was sick, you suddenly rediscovered how to be a son and a parent. I do not believe that transformation was about me or about Danny. I believe it was about what you thought you stood to gain. I built everything I built, the store, the properties, everything during and after the years you weren't here. I built it while your son grew up in my house, ate at my table, and became, through no effort of yours, the finest young man I have ever known. That was not an accident of blood. That was a choice made every single day for 15 years by a boy you left behind and a grandfather who chose to stay. You do not get a share of a life you refuse to be part of. This is not punishment. This is simply accuracy. I am leaving you nothing because you left first. I watched my father's face go through several stages, confusion, disbelief, and then a kind of dawning fury that turned his cheeks blotchy red. My mother had gone completely still, her hand frozen on his knee. To my grandson, Daniel Foster, Mr. Given continued, who never once asked to be left, and never once made me feel like a burden for staying, I leave everything. The business, Foster and Sons Home Supply, both locations and all associated property. My investment accounts. My house and the land it sits on. Every dollar I have ever earned or saved. It is his, outright, effective immediately, with no conditions attached except one instruction, which I ask him to honor, though it is not legally binding, only a request from a grandfather to a grandson he is enormously proud of. Danny, don't let this money make you bitter or cruel. I did not build this so you could punish your parents forever. I built it so you would never again have to feel like you weren't wanted. Use it to build a life. Use it to be the kind of person who stays for a spouse, for children, for anyone who needs someone to stay. That's the only inheritance that actually matters. The money is just the tool. The room was silent when Mr. Given finished reading. My father was the first to speak, his voice cracking with barely controlled rage. This is insane, he said. He can't do this. 15 years, and he cuts us out completely? We're his family. He was very clear about his wishes, Richard, Mr. Given said calmly. And the will is airtight. I drafted it myself, with 2 independent witnesses and a full psychological evaluation on file confirming your father's competency at the time of signing, specifically because he anticipated this reaction. My mother finally spoke, her voice thin. "Danny. Sweetheart. You wouldn't really take everything, would you? We're your parents." I really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in years. And I thought about the porch and the suitcase and the one-eyed rabbit and the sound of their car driving away without slowing down at the stop sign. "You were," I said quietly. "For 8 years, you were my parents. Then you weren't. Grandpa was." I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My grandfather had already said everything that needed to be said, in his own voice, from beyond the grave, in a room he'd chosen specifically so they'd have to hear it out loud, together, with no way to soften it or spin it into something else later. My parents contested the will, of course. Their lawyer argued undue influence, argued that I'd somehow manipulated a dying old man. It didn't hold up. Mr. Given had prepared for exactly this. Years of documentation, the psychological evaluation, witness statements from employees and neighbors who'd watched my grandfather raise me with clear eyes and clear intentions long before any cancer diagnosis. The court dismissed the case within 4 months. I did do one thing my grandfather didn't ask me to do, and didn't put in his will, because I think even he might not have expected it of me. I set up a small, modest trust, not for my parents, but for the version of the story he was trying to tell. I donated a portion of the estate to a foundation supporting kinship caregivers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings who step in and raise children their own parents can't or won't. People like my grandfather. People nobody writes songs about, but who quietly hold a child's entire world together while somebody else gets to walk away. As for my parents, I didn't cut them off with cruelty, but I also didn't invite them back in. My father sends an email every few months, usually when money is tight again, dressed up as a check-in on how I'm doing. I read them. I don't always answer. That's not spite. It's just accuracy, the same word my grandfather used. I owe them the truth, not access to a life they walked away from. I run Foster and Sons now. 2 locations became 5 over the past 3 years. I kept every single employee my grandfather ever hired, because he taught me that loyalty runs both directions or it doesn't count for anything. I still work the floor sometimes, just to remind myself where all of this actually came from, not from luck, not from blood, but from a man who decided, on an ordinary afternoon in 2009, that a small boy standing on his porch deserved better than what his own son was offering him. Every year, on the anniversary of the day they left me there, I go back to that porch. The house is mine now, technically, but it will always just be Grandpa's house to me. I sit on the top step, where I sat with my suitcase and my one-eyed rabbit, and I think about how the worst day of my childhood turned out to be the beginning of the best relationship of my life. My parents left me at my grandfather's house and never looked back. His final instruction made sure they got exactly what they'd earned. Nothing. But what he actually left me was never really about the money. It was about proof, undeniable, irreversible, written down and read aloud proof that showing up for someone, every single day, for 15 years straight, is worth more than any inheritance a person could ever write into a will. He showed up. That's the whole story. Everything else is just details.